Hey guys, episode 70 of the Luke Macias Show. Today, Raz Shafer comes back and joins us. You might remember Raz. He was on quite a few of the first early episodes, but Raz joins me to talk about Just Mercy. It's a film that has been made available free to many audiences on Amazon Prime. And so Raz and I were just texting back and forth, realizing we were both watching this movie. And so decided just to jump on Zoom the next day and have a conversation about it. This is a conversation that if you want to listen to, I'd appreciate it. But also keep in mind that if you're trying to figure out, what Raz and I think about every single issue that's currently facing us regarding the racial tensions in the United States, you're not really going to get that from this conversation. So if you're trying to read into it, please don't. It's a pretty nuanced situation that we're in right now. And, there are a lot of people that are protesting violently, and there are those who are just protesting. There are those who are angry. There are those who are just trying to communicate their belief system. And on the other side, there are a lot of Americans, I think the vast majority of Americans, who absolutely despise violent protests, absolutely despise people who are destroying people's properties and, ransacking black businesses. And that's a major problem, even of people who believe that injustice is going on. And so either side that you are on regarding your particular emotional bent towards the current tensions that are here, just understand that right now you've got two guys, Raz and myself, who watched this film and just kind of use it as a springboard to talk about some of the different perspectives that exist within the injustices that have already, and we know the injustices that we acknowledge have existed within the United States of America, what those injustices are, some of the issues that exist. So if I wanted to find a way to have a conversation around this issue also while not telling you exactly what the right answer was regarding every single item. So I hope you enjoy it. Well, welcome back. It has been too long, Mr. Raz Shafer. You've been absent, and I guess I probably shouldn't complain because I haven't been inviting you, right? And that's for those who listened to the show early on, Raz and I were on quite a bit in those early days, and then I realized I really didn't like the inconvenience of having to coordinate this on a weekly basis. And so my conversations are every other week. And then every other week, I really just sit down whenever I want, 10, 15 minutes. And Raz was getting in my way. So he hadn't been here as often.
I do that a lot.
Yeah. I'm sorry. You're a much bigger man than me. Okay. I don't ever get that.
Yeah, at least literally, if not figuratively.
Yeah. I'm never in anybody's way. That's the problem. They could I have to get out of the way. That's just my only option. Well, Raz, why don't you just give me an update, and we'll, get back to other politics and other stuff at a later point. But I know that our world is in a crazy time right now, and wanted to bring on a good friend to just chat about where things are going. Did y'all go to church today, or?
No, I've been doing podcasts, and some of our lives, or sometimes they were live streaming. Our church is doing live streaming. Some they've been recorded. So I've been probably doing some of those. But it's been weird, man. Our church is starting. We've kind of relocated down to the Stephenville area. I live in Fort Worth, at least for the moment, and we've kind of relocated down to my parents' ranch where I grew up for the last couple months because I couldn't travel for work, and my boys twice a week Mother's Day out thing was done. So it was like, hey, let's head to the ranch and have time with family. And it's been awesome. As not because of COVID, but sped up because we were down here. We're making some relocation plans to build a house down here and enjoying the country life, man. As you know, before about 15 minutes for this podcast, I've been out all day working on the tractor, shredding about 15 acres of pasture. And it's a good thing that I washed up a little bit beforehand, because I've been enjoying the country life quite a bit.
That's awesome. And if your video gets a little spotty or spotty on the recording, we'll blame the fact that you happen to be enjoying the country life more than.
Yes.
Raz, I think that we were going to start this conversation. I just watched the movie Just Mercy, and I think you've watched the movie recently and read the book. And so it kind of provides a good starting point, I think, to just discuss that story a little bit, but then also maybe the broader issues that get brought up as a result of both that story and its application to the situation we find today.
Absolutely.
You've both read the book and watched the movie. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I know you told me I need to read the book, and I will think about it. My book reading time is so limited that whenever there's a movie and a book, the book has like no chance. I feel like
That's the opposite of the way it should be, Luke. That's the opposite of the way you're supposed to look at it.
If there's only a book, I'm gonna have to read that book, right? But if there's a movie,
we're gonna have to work on this
and go like, I got that story. I got what they wanted to tell me. So yeah.
Oh my. Okay, we're gonna have to work on that offline. We're
How big is
that character feeling.
The book? How long is the audiobook? Do you know?
It was right about 11 hours.
Okay.
I knocked it out. I started listening to it earlier this week, and I knocked it out in the last few days.
Yep.
It's really compelling.
Yep. Well, why don't you just give us a little bit of your thought process on that story in general? You have, more of an understanding of the narrative than even I do, and I will add in some additional observations.
Well, I'll start out kind of just expressing why I read the book. I think probably similar to you, as all this craziness has been going on the last several weeks, especially since George Floyd's killing, it's the search for answers and search for understanding has been pretty strong. I don't understand a lot of what's going on right now, and I feel like the message of this podcast is probably I don't know, but I think that's appropriate for this situation. And I'd been talking with my pastor and just texting with him, and he had recommended the book as, if nothing else, a good place to understand some other perspectives, to listen. And I think that's a particularly hard skill for me sometimes, listening. But I think when you don't understand something, it's hard to figure out how you can get a better understanding without listening. And so I was like, okay, cool. I'll check out this book. And I'd seen the movie was available, and was free. It's free this month on Amazon Prime, and I think some other places as well. And so I said, okay, I want to watch the movie, but I also figured, hey, let's check out the book. Mm-hmm. And Bryan, the guy that's the writer that started the Equal Justice Initiative, he tells his story. He tells a story of the gentleman that's featured primarily in the movie, and he tells the story of a lot of other people, many of which are kind of brought in some means through the movie. I think it's a powerful movie. I would encourage the book simply because it fleshes out a lot of things that I think the movie doesn't have the time to do.
Yep. You and I probably spend a little bit more time around the criminal justice system than the average person, not on a personal level, thank the Lord, but just from being in the political and policy sphere and initiatives, we've probably had a little bit more exposure. I feel like for the average American person, even just the injustices that exist within the criminal justice system aren't as obvious to most Americans. I remember when the First Step Act was recently signed in by President Trump. And, I shared the press conference where that was rolled out, that this was going to essentially become law, and saying, hey, this is a great policy. Now, I might disagree with some criminal justice reformers on how far they would go. Some people think this is the first step and there's a second and a third step. And there's going to be less and less agreement as you go more steps down the road. I don't want to go into too much criminal justice reform, but I really supported a lot of the policy that was passed, and noticed that honestly, it didn't get that much attention from a press perspective. The criminal justice system is not the sexiest thing to discuss, even reforming the criminal justice system, right? And you have Republicans and Democrats coming together, the President of the United States saying, I want to pass this policy initiative, which really got it through the Senate. And so Just Mercy to me is like a window into some of the injustices that exist, that we know exist within the system. Some of it is also the historical and the historicity of the Alabama criminal justice system, a lot of these areas in the South, the injustices that existed within them. And so I do think that the movie, the narrative, the story is really good for anybody who just thinks that there's nothing worth being upset about, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
We're gonna get into whether or not what the solution is, right? And what I think there seems to be even more disagreement over the solution than necessarily the problem. But to me, the good news about Just Mercy is it's a very well done story, a very compelling, accurate, at least from a lot of the things shared. I've got a little bit of concern on the Herbert Richardson side that I think you and I mentioned, so I'll let you flesh that out a little bit more. But the story is what it is, right? I mean, there are individuals that were put behind bars. There were people charged with crimes they did not commit. And this is not something that has only happened to African Americans, but it also is something that has specifically happened to African Americans, right? And even in this case, being done in a way that seemed to also have racial motivations to some extent. So anything else that you pulled from the book, even more so than the movie, when it comes to like real things that actually happened that came to light?
Well, I think for me, one of the biggest takeaways from both, I think you can get it from the movie, but just the volume of stories that were shared in the book helped to flesh this out more in my mind. Is, one of the questions I think a lot of people have had over the last couple of weeks is, why are they so mad about why are Black people, or why are protesters so mad about police? Why are they so why are they angry? Why is there such a level of distrust? And why would they see protest as their mechanism, or in some cases riot as their mechanism of being heard? And I think that one of the things that came to mind for me is that I think that the police, they're the most obvious initial point of contact, and I think there is some unique injustices that start there. But you watch the movie, reading the book, it really came through clearly to me that when we're talking about, even if we look at it as a historical thing, so why would you be angry about, we fixed all that, or we fixed these things, we've got these guys out of prison. It becomes quite a bit more clear to me why there could be some profound distrust of the justice system in general. Mm-hmm. And police and law enforcement are part of that. Courts are another part of that. I think how we view our role as citizens, and how the idea of mercy versus quote unquote justice. I think all those things are facets, but at least in my mind, I'm starting to play out the idea is, okay, so if we want to rebuild, or even just say build a trust in a justice system with a group of people that have been profoundly wronged in a lot of ways over a fair amount of history, mm-hmm. Fairly recent history, what would we do? And I don't know the answer to that, but it does become a little more clear to me that if you've got people who have grown up with their dad or their granddad in jail for something that they know didn't commit, or felt like it was what happened was unjust, mm-hmm. It becomes a little more clear why that might be some really profound anger about those things. And I don't know what to do about it, but it has helped, I think, empathize quite a bit more with some of those frustrations. And it has changed how I view the complexity of the quote unquote solution.
Yep. I think, one of the quotes at the very end, when they're talking before the U.S. Senate, he says, and this is kind of the idea, the theme of the whole story, right? He says, we all need justice, we all need mercy, and we all need some level of unmerited grace, right? And I think one of the concerning realities that we're seeing play out is that someone's feeling that they have not received mercy or grace makes them very unlikely to give mercy or grace in return. And what I mean by that is, it's like, in some ways you have so it's like a married couple, right? And so you might feel wronged by the other person. And if your attitude is, they've wronged me, I'm pissed, I'm angry, no matter what they do, you're still gonna be pissed, right? And you might even have unreasonable expectations for what they're going to do to earn back. And in that idea that within this discussion, I've been encouraged by some conversations I've been able to have this week, because there has been grace and mercy throughout the conversations. But there are a lot of people on both sides of this discussion that can enter the discussion completely unprepared to extend any mercy or grace to either other side, right?
It's not natural for us as people, right?
No.
I mean, and that's part of where is, as Christians, we look at this, and the idea of grace and mercy are something that we're familiar with, because on a salvation eternal level, we know that we've been extended that when we didn't deserve it. And I think that that's where, as Christians, we have a unique duty to try to show that, to try to be willing to turn that other cheek, and to be willing to understand that we do need mercy and grace in a pretty profound way, and that extends to those around us. There's actually one story from the book it's not covered in the movie, and it ties into this. Towards the end of the book, when they've after they've freed a prisoner, had a different case that got resolved, there was this old black lady that was sitting in the hall in this courthouse, and they made eye contact, and she called him over, and she sat down, and she said, "You're a stone catcher." And she explained the analogy of looking at, he who casts the first stone, looking at biblical stoning, and she used it to make a pretty profound analogy about grace and mercy. And in her case, her first entree to the criminal justice system was when, I think it was her grandson was murdered by two guys, two young black boys. And they, after they were sentenced, she thought she was going to feel profound relief. She thought she'd feel justice, and she didn't. And she realized how much the family of those boys and so many people that she saw through the court needed grace and needed mercy and needed love. And she ended up coming on a daily basis just back to that courthouse just to love people and just to spend time there and to hug the people that needed hugs. And she didn't care whether they were with the defendant or with the plaintiff's family, the victim's family. It didn't matter her. She said, "I'm a stone catcher," and she recognized Bryan and what he was doing, and drew him into that and shared that analogy. And I feel like that's something that we need to think more about, because it's, as Christians, we have that example. We live that example daily of what mercy is, and how much we don't want justice for ourselves and our own sins. And so I think that is a unique area where most of the world, especially non-Christians, it makes sense why they might understand what these things are, but we don't have that excuse.
We, the foundational understanding of what redemption and what is required to feel redemption is something that is a little bit is a little bit more potent to us, and something that we've experienced, right? It's interesting when it comes to the Christian faith, right? Because we know that a penalty was paid, right? A wrong was committed and somebody had to pay. And so today I, went to a church and did not wear a mask. Please don't get, nobody get pissed off in the internet world. If you wore a mask, that's great. I'm totally cool. I don't think you're any less Christian for wearing a mask. But I walked into a building with 50 believers, and we sang, we worshiped, and we spoke the words of Christ, because Christ is the one who paid that penalty, right? And when injustice happens, often it's easy to point out when the injustice happens, right? And to me, one of the things that's a little difficult to know in these situations, and maybe we just need to be okay not knowing within this. Maybe it's even important to communicate, let's not even get there with who's to blame, because that's probably where you're going to have even more friction, is because there's frustration and injustice, but nobody knows who to blame, right? Are you to blame for being part of it? Are you to blame because you've benefited from it? Have you benefited from it? In what way have you benefited from it? Should you feel sorrow for that? that's when I think we get into these more fundamental questions that are kind of ripping at the fabric of society. To your point, it's maybe that's while we're trying to press in and understand that a wrong has been done. I might not believe that a wrong was done by me, right? Now I might have done a wrong, and if so, I'd like to know if I've done a wrong, right? I mean, you and I both have people in our life that will wrong at some point, and there's a desire who they are to say, hey, let's sit down, let's figure out what we need to do to reconcile, right? And if I've wronged you, I want to communicate that. And so I think that's an important, you got to be willing to do that. You've also got to be willing to actually, the one quote I saw that I think is relevant here is it says, there's no virtue in owning a sin you haven't committed, right? And so then the question becomes, a sin was committed against somebody. Now, let's all agree that this sin was committed. And for, I think, most people, that's really what we need to agree on, right? This sin was committed, this injustice happened. And then the question is, who committed it? Who's guilty? How should they be treated? And then the question also, is there systematic problems that make this sin repeatable that are being ignored, right? That's another question, which I think is ready to ask. We had the Ahmaud Arbery case in Georgia, that happened. And just with the death of a young man who was truly gunned down. And I mean gunned down by two racist, bad, evil people, right? And it's important for us to recognize too, like if you watch Just Mercy and say, oh, wow, there were some white racist people in Alabama back then. There are some very Caucasian racist people in Georgia, like last week. Okay. This is not something that has existed. Now, racism, it also isn't something that exists only within one skin tone, right? There are racist people of all ethnicities.
But just real quick, I think part of what you mentioned there is we're dwelling on for a minute. It ties into, looking at what is the wrong. And we can look on a micro level and say, Ahmaud Arbery was murdered. George Floyd was murdered. These things happen. Yeah. I think that we can also say, okay, there are probably other parts to it we don't understand, especially when we look into the Just Mercy story and some of the stories you talk about in the book, these real life individuals, and say, okay, these are not a small number of people who, over even just during Bryan's time working in this in the criminal justice system, have experienced these types of things. So tying that in with the idea of turning the other cheek, when we have people who are, people who are out there saying that we're complicit, that we're racist or something like that because I'm white or because we're privileged or whatever these things, I think that's an example of where there's an element of owning or extending grace and saying, these people are mad about real things. And I may not understand it, and I may not need to own something because I did it. And I think you're right. There's no virtue in owning a sin you didn't do. But I think that's where we say, first of all, I'm going to extend mercy here. I'm going to extend grace because I don't understand what's going on here. I don't have to own it, but I can also say there's a lot going on here. Yeah. And that ties into that listening side and say, okay, I don't think I am complicit. Maybe I am in some way, and I can listen. And that's probably a good thing for me not to just definitely say I have no part in this. There's nothing I could have done. But at the very least, we can extend some mercy and say, okay, you're angry and you have a lot of right to be angry. And you're blaming me for this, but I'm not going to respond in kind. I'm going to listen. I'm going to pray. I'm going to try to find ways that I can be helpful in solving the real problems that are creating this anger.
I think it's also I want to preface that with, I don't think the vast majority of people on one side or the other are just pointing the finger. And I know that's, at least from the discussions I've been having, right? So what happens most of the time, and what frustrates me sometimes, is just everyone's going to put you in the box, right? If you communicate your frustration one way or the other, they're immediately going to go, I know exactly what you believe on all 10 issues regarding these race tensions right now, and I'm just going to stick you there. And it's a lot easier to do that with people. The less that happens, the better. But it's not, definitely, I don't feel like the vast majority of people, even people that are angry at the system, look at every single person that doesn't look like them and says, you need to apologize to me, right? Now, there are those who have that attitude. And then there are those on the other side that have the attitude, I didn't do jack, I ain't saying nothing. And almost in a way of like, you don't have, to your point, it can communicate that you don't have any reason to be angry whatsoever, right? Because if I'm not going to own it, which might even be correct that you didn't do anything wrong, but that does not mean that that person doesn't have some justification within their frustration, right?
I mean, it's easy to look at social media and say, I think it does increase the polarization that we see, or at least the perception of it.
Yeah.
I think that in these conversations, the ones that we have off social media, there's probably a very different tone. There's probably a lot less blame. I mean, in social media, we're casting this out to the whole wide world, and so it's very easy. One, to say things that if we took a second thought about it, do you really think that? And the answer would be no. Or does everybody this way? But we end up painting with broad brushstrokes, and I think that's part of why social media is such an unhelpful thing in this time. Is like, have a real conversation with somebody, white, black, brown, yellow, doesn't matter, but have a conversation. And especially as we've been locked into only social media contact for the last 3 months, that just makes things worse.
We, when it comes to one of the points I was going to make within this conversation, and this just goes back to just mercy, I know that there is valid concern of a pendulum swing one way or the other, right? And I want to be really careful about how that people could interpret that wrong by saying, oh, you want to be real, slow about this. Any injustice that happens anywhere should be immediately rectified, and done away with. When they told the story, the movie, I think, did a worse job than what you've told me was done in the book. But there's a character in there, Herbert Richardson, right? And Herbert Richardson in the movie is portrayed as this kind of nice old man who, just made a mistake and has some issues in the head and was railroaded through a criminal justice system that, in a sense, it kind of comes across to me as though like he's definitely portrayed as the victim. And this is what gets really messy within his situation because he actually committed a crime. Now, again, if you're in jail or prison for not committing a crime you didn't commit, there is zero, you are 100% the victim of that situation. But in Herbert Richardson's situation, he did commit a crime. He did make a bomb to scare his girlfriend. 11-year-old girl picked up that bomb, his girlfriend's ex-girlfriend's niece, and she was killed, right? And if you just take a second, my wife and I were watching the movie, and again, we both thought it was fantastic, recommended it to other people. But I told her that fact, 90% of the way through the movie, and said, hey, do you know what Herbert Richardson did? And I told her. And she said, wow, that puts a very different perspective, right? Because what I did was I just brought in this situation, and again, this is not like all the situations, but in the Herbert Richardson story, I just brought in the other victim, right? The 11-year-old girl and her family and her siblings and the girl with her and her aunt and all these other people that you now are thinking about. And all of a sudden there's not just one victim in this situation. Now, you brought up the point that you felt like in the book, the message about Herbert Richardson, because I don't think this is done well in the movie. So if anything, this is my one critique. And I think it kind of takes away from the story of Just Mercy and these injustices that happen. But it's kind of portrayed as this guy was just railroaded through the system. I think you say that in the book, it comes across a little bit more like he just shouldn't have gotten the death penalty for a person he definitely killed, an 11-year-old girl that he killed. And that maybe the level of insanity also that you described in the book is definitely not portrayed in the movie. So like, according to you, just the ultra level of insanity this guy was in, his mental state was just completely out of whack. And you told me about like the doctor who ruled him competent was actually later had his license removed, stuff like that. So why don't you just expound there? Because I just think that it's important to at least have some conversation about the nuance that exists within some of the injustices that people are going to talk about within the system. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Well, as you mentioned, because of the way they portray that in the movie, it can be, I think it could be used as for some people to try to undermine the message of it overall, which I think would be unfortunate.
Yeah.
In Herbert Richardson's case, he was a Vietnam veteran. He later had a car wreck, which he was never treated for. He just literally drove home, and it seems to have been the catalyst for some pretty severe mental problems. Everything from compounding with the PTSD that he faced in Nam. There's literally I think as they may mention the video or in the movie, but he was literally the sole survivor of a ambush where his whole platoon was killed in Nam. The guy faced some pretty serious stuff. It then went downhill. He started having all kinds of problems. He'd literally run out of his house naked, screaming incoming and trying to warn his neighbors about mortar shells and stuff incoming. He ended up becoming quite literally obsessed with this woman he was dating, and their relationship went downhill as a result of his obsession and the mental problems. And in a crazy effort to win her affection back, he had built this bomb. He put it on our front porch. It was timed, and before it went off, it was meant to basically scare her. And then he thought, in his adult state, that she was going to come running back to him for safety. Before the bomb was timed, the timer clicked down. Her niece came on the front porch, picked it up, and shook it, and it went off and killed her. Part of what the book goes into great detail on is, first of all, Bryan never excused what he done. He's very transparent as far as he did this. He was not all there. His mind was not functioning correctly. He didn't have intent to kill, but he nonetheless did kill. The intent to kill factors into his assessment of the criminal justice system and the fact that it would probably take too long to go into all the different ways that he was done wrong there. But one of them, as I recall, I believe it was this case where the doctor who basically said he was competent to stand trial later turned out he was not a doctor. He was literally, they found out he was a fraud. He had no medical training whatsoever, no psychiatric training. It was just, but had committed fraud to get himself in as this expert, and was in judging these guys who were mentally incompetent as competent to stand trial. Yeah. They would not factor in the intent to kill. There's a host of really horrible injustices that occurred throughout the trial. And so I think that there are two things that that are important about his story. One is that I think the other side that they used more clearly in the Just Mercy movie was to give perspective on the death penalty and to really raise a question of, is this right? Is it the right way to handle these kind of situations? In his case, the book makes a very strong argument for why that he should not have been given the death penalty under any circumstances, but also why there's probably another he might have been put in a mental institution or some kind of other psychiatric help. But I think they use it in the movie as primarily to raise the question of, what does the death penalty look like? What does that actually do? And so that as a result, there are some of the other perspectives on the case that are not highlighted just because it's in a feature film, not a 11-hour audiobook.
Yep. No, and I don't want to get into a huge rabbit trail of the death penalty, right? I support the death penalty. I know Texans are like specifically more supportive of the death penalty. It's really interesting in the polling. I think last time I was looking, even Democrats in Texas are more pro-death penalty than Democrats in other states and stuff. I don't know if it's just a cultural thing or whatever, the Wild West. But there's definitely a support of that as something that exists for the most heinous crimes within our society, right? And then you could be a supporter of the death penalty, but then also want it very, very minorly or narrowly applied. And then you could be somebody who opposes it altogether. And of course, there's a lot of people that oppose that as well. But I think that's separate from the Just Mercy story, the Ahmaud Arbery story, the situations, and Ahmaud Arbery and the Just Mercy movie, I think, are worth looking at together because just mercy is something that is set more historically there. So I could see some people watching it and going, oh, this has never happened again. And then Ahmaud Arbery is like a situation where I think we can see, no, it happened like last month. Okay. And by the way, that's a specific situation. I think that's different than the George Floyd deal, where I think that people saw it and immediately took action. Ahmaud Arbery was something which really got seemingly covered up and not addressed, and only addressed once it became very apparent that once the whole world saw it, right? And so I think that's, really, it's just an unfortunate thing, but it also tells us that, yes, this is happening today, right? And we still might, like I said, disagree on who all is to blame. And that to me is probably where more of the tension is right now. And I don't know whether that means we should be talking more about that, or whether it means now's not the time to talk about that. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, just kind of going back to the death penalty real quick, because I think it ties in here. Even if you're someone who is completely in favor of the death penalty from a theoretical position of saying there are some crimes for which someone should die, that is even if you believe that's completely appropriate, the Just Mercy movie and the plethora of stories in the book raise the question in my mind: is it possible to heal some of these wounds and to change this conversation if the death penalty has been used historically? If this is true, which it seems to be, that it has been used in many cases unjustly against so many people that are African Americans, is it worth it? And even if it is, should it be considered as far as is it a policy question that we can say, as long as this is out there, there is going to be a very real fear among people that this could continue to be misused? And I don't know the answer to that. What I do know the answer is, I think that is that you and I view the death penalty very differently than a lot of the people. I think that where Bryan, that wrote Just Mercy, the way he views it is, one, I do think he's categorically opposed to it.
Correct. I think
frankly, but I think that some of the other reasons are that he's seen a lot of examples where he's like, this was not a just punishment. And so you can look at it from saying, okay, if this has been used so badly in the past, might that be something we say we need to reexamine this? Not because some people don't deserve to die, but because if we're going to try to heal these larger wounds and try to generate a trust in the justice system, that might be something that needs to be on the table. And I don't know the answer to that, but I think that's at least a window into the perspective a lot of people are having on this. And it's definitely something that's churning in my mind.
It is a, I go back to the Ronald Reagan quote when he says, we're blessed to not live in pale and timid times, right? And I feel like he had no idea what 2020 was going to hold.
Golly.
That deal. I'm not saying the Cold War wasn't a big deal, but I'm saying that, you don't really feel like saying it in the middle of 2020. And so, no, I think it's really important that, to your point, these conversations are harder and harder to have on social media. They're easier to have one-on-one. They're easier discussions to facilitate. It's something that people should be willing to do. And I know I've said this a bunch of times. I think on both sides, because I think our message has largely, what we've been talking about is largely why people who don't think that there's as much of an issue should at least examine and be aware and understand and hear and see. And that comes from your and I's perspective. I also think on the other side of this, the people who are very angry because of the injustices that exist, and I don't want to sound like I'm not very angry, because that movie pissed me off. You know what I found interesting about Just Mercy, which is why I like it, is that they keep having these breaks in their case, and then you're like, sweet, they have the recording, it's over, touchdown, and then it gets shut down.
It's so much worse in the book. It's so much worse in the book, man.
Yeah, no, I'm sure.
I mean, and it's not just his story.
Yeah.
There's so many of these, and it's absolutely gut wrenching. I honestly, I couldn't watch. I was halfway through the book when I started watching the movie. I couldn't watch the movie until I knew how the book was going to end. There's something about it. It was just the book itself was so gut wrenching to me that I was like, I don't know if they're going to kill this guy. Like I straight up, I had to stop watching the movie. I was like, I got to finish reading the book because I can't take. It's like, I don't know if I can watch the movie knowing all of what I know now. I don't know if I can watch the movie with them killing this guy. I mean, it was just straight up. I had to turn it off. I couldn't watch that, and there's so many more in there, and there's some people I've seen on social media. I think there's an attitude of like, well, why are you so mad about that? We fixed that stuff. This guy was released from prison in 1993. Okay. Now I know we had a lot of people that maybe listen to this that were born since then. It's not that long ago, or at least in the idea of this 30 something, it's not that long ago. And even if you do think that all of a sudden at 1993 everything was fixed and there were no other areas where the judicial system could have been used to abuse people since 1993, if you had an uncle or like your whole family, let alone community, was raised with this as in the background, this is how they will treat you, or they can treat you, and with like real life examples of people you're blood related to, how would that color the way you look at the police or look at a judge, or your concern level with being arrested or detained? I mean, this is really horrific. And there was an article that I read by a Minneapolis defense attorney who basically said, okay, it was like, what would have happened if George Floyd had lived? And it was really an interesting question. And it actually, it highlights the perversity of the justice system in a different way. So for background, Floyd, the 911 was called because there was a clerk that said he used a counterfeit $20 bill.
Yep.
I have not seen conclusive evidence whether it was he literally just had one. I've seen nothing that suggested he forged it. But I have seen examples where people were questioning why he had one in his possession. Either way, they get called. He's detained by the police a few minutes later and ends up not wanting to get in the cop car because I didn't do anything wrong. I don't know why you're arresting me. And then that degenerates into them. The guy put his knee on his neck and killing him. But the story goes on to basically say what would have happened. And it said, well, he would have been charged with resisting arrest, failure to follow lawful order, and the forgery, and possibly assaulting a police officer just for resisting. Yeah. And the guy makes a convincing case for why Floyd would eventually have the forgery dropped, but would have been prosecuted, convicted, and had jail time for the other two. Yep. Look at that. It's like, how does this make sense? Yep. And it's like, this is ridiculous that he would have had the reason he was stopped, that was dropped, but because he said you didn't have any reason to arrest me, what are you doing? This doesn't make sense. Because he questions and wanted an answer, didn't want to just hop in the cop car. It's like, that's perverse in and of itself. And he uses that to highlight that these things happen on a not infrequent basis. Yeah. So I think when we look at there's some serious distrust, not just the police, they get the headlines as far as the protests and stuff. But I think that when you watch Just Mercy and read that book, you start to see how the police are the gateway. They're the first interaction people have with the judicial system, and they're the ones that get blamed with that. But actually the blame, as far as the perceived blame, if not actual blame, goes to the entire judicial system. Because you see these situations where it's not the police may be the arresting officer, but even if the police officer did things right, the judicial system is used as a beating stick and in some pretty horrific ways. And I was like, man, I don't know how you fix some of that, right? I don't know the answer to some of that, but I can look at that and say there are significant problems here.
So I don't want this statement to sound to anybody like I'm giving you, all the solutions. Our criminal justice system is very much broken down into classes, right? And a lot of it has to do with how much you can pay for a good defense attorney. And that's the unfortunate thing that I think is just the more I look at the system, it's not, I know some great district attorneys. I know some great assistant district attorneys. I know some really good defense attorneys. I know some disgusting defense attorneys, all sides of the system. But the system as a whole at the end of the day, I see unequal justice for anybody who's basically stuck with a public defender. And that's not even to say that I know people who are public defenders and who work really hard, but I'm saying that basically white, brown, black, yellow, if you're really poor and get arrested and have additional problems and get stuck in jail, this system is going to really wreck your life. And if you've got financial means and you run into an issue with law enforcement, as long as you can write a check, there's going to be enough protections, because in a sense, the Constitution protects you enough, but the system is not set up to protect your constitutional rights at every single level. And again, that's not, I don't even have all the solutions either, but that's just kind of how I've seen it the more I've observed the existing system that is there. I'm not.
Well, and kind of building on that, I think there's a host of, I think, injustices that people might attribute to racism that I think it can be traced to other things. It doesn't make them less unjust, but it does actually complicate the solution. Because if everything was attributable simply to racism and hating people with a different colored skin, then you could look at a mental change and say, okay, well, we need to change people's lens. We need to convince them that bigotry is wrong. That would be one thing. But I actually think that, and this is something that's underlined in the book and the movie, I think there's parts of it where there are other incentives that are at play. A district attorney that says, hey, my job is to convict people, and I put my faith in these police officers, and I'm going to use everything within my power to throw at this person, and sees that as their job, which in a certain way it is. But how that plays into the charges that are filed, and adding all the possible charges, whether or not we look at it and say, do they deserve that? And view that as a tool and how they use that. There's a lot of these facets that I think, I'm not convinced are being used in completely racist ways, but they do have a huge effect that can appear that way.
Yeah.
Right. And so whether or not it is, we need to pay attention to some of those things as we're looking towards any types of solutions.
And the socioeconomic disparity that exists within, the color of people's skin as a whole in the United States of America is going to have massive effects, right? It's going to affect the amount of single parent households within the Black community versus the Hispanic community versus the white community versus the Asian community is going to have a massive effect. Like, these things are going to then cause your interaction maybe to increase within the criminal justice system, which is then going to cause you to encounter the injustices that even exist within the criminal justice system more often. To that, I will specify, the only pushback I'll give is I do think that there are a lot of people on this one that are pushing the pendulum too far, because this criminal justice reform movement can get taken away to the point to where, and you even saw it recently with COVID, where you had, local district attorneys that are basically refusing to even prosecute certain crimes. And when you have entire cities that go, hey, you can steal $1,000 worth of stuff and we're not going to prosecute you, there's actually a problem. So there are some urban areas that we're actually seeing the criminal justice, the desire to reform a broken system, actually pendulum swing to the point of not keeping the community safe. And
that's where I think we've got to be careful about directing, making any big policy prescriptions without taking a serious, deep look at this, right? If you look at the suggestions of the Black Lives Matter, the organization, if you look at there's another one, there's like Quick 8 or something about 8. They have 8 policy solution prescriptions. Like, when I look at the policy prescriptions that some of these national groups have, I'm left completely baffled. I don't believe, I think the system would be worse if they just implemented them, especially if they just thought the problem was fixed then. Yeah. I think that's where we have to say, okay, well, let's have an idea what the problem is. And there's a lot of small ones. There's some big problems. I think there's a lot of small problems that, unless we actually take a deep dive into what the problem is, or what the whole issue is, we can't possibly solve it. And we could make the problem much worse. Yeah. I will say that's not an excuse for inaction. That's not an excuse for, there are some things that probably should be done very rapidly.
Yeah.
But I think that it's really easy, especially on social media, for us to say, hey, let's get behind the Black Lives Matter national movement or these quick bite-sized policy prescriptions, and people would think that their job is done. And that's not going to solve the problems that Bryan talks about and that Just Mercy is highlighting.
Yep. Well, Raz, thanks for coming. Thanks for talking. And
It's my pleasure, brother.
I don't know if we solved all that much, and there's a whole lot left unsaid. And I will close. I still have a also overarching concern because I think in the course, and it happened again today with a very good friend of mine who posted, made her Facebook post to all of her white friends to hear a certain message. And I honestly have more racially tinged communication on social media in the last 2 weeks, which I'm really, really, really concerned about, because it's difficult. I feel like if I titled this conversation, Raz, like two white guys review Just Mercy, a bunch of people would listen to it, right? Because they'd literally be like, let's see what two white guys think about Just Mercy. I'm not even white, I'm brown. It depends. I've been inside a lot recently. I need to get outside so that I look more brown. But it's really scary that that's where we're at. And it's actually, I think, unhealthy that we're at a societal place where in the course of trying to address racial tensions, people are becoming more racist within their language. And that's just another generally concerning trend that I see. I think that people, regardless of whether you watch Just Mercy or read policy initiatives for criminal justice reform, if you don't have an understanding, to your point, of redemption, if you don't have an understanding to the one reality that we're in a fallen world with injustice that does exist and has existed before any of us showed up and will exist when we leave this planet, if we leave, unless the Lord tarries, which I'd be totally cool with. But in that circumstance, injustice exists, and it's those injustices, and it's our hearts yearn for justice that I think our Creator fulfilled in His Son. And that understanding of redemption, and also the price, the cost of grace and mercy and redemption, it got paid with a price. And I think a lot of people want to know who's going to pay the price. And at least we also have a message that these injustices have been paid for. They have been. They have been paid for with the blood, I think, of Jesus. And I believe and I have faith in that. And I don't say that to just wash over it and tell people, don't worry about it, everything's going to be fine, they've already been taken care of. But it's to say that also you could pass your 8 policies, you could read all your books that you want all your white friends to read so that they understand, you could go to a bunch of protests, and did you know that you could defund every police officer in the country, and in 5 years you're going to have a bunch of injustices, and your heart's still going to yearn for justice. The good thing is we should yearn for justice, but we need to make sure that we don't create even more hell in our pursuit of man-made solutions to a fallen world. I don't know. So that's just another general observation.
But I got one final point in the story as we're wrapping up. As far as suggestions, we've already kind of covered that we don't really have a whole lot. We don't know the answer to a lot of these problems. We don't even necessarily have a full grasp of the scope of some of these injustices. But when it comes to how we're interacting with people on social media, that's an easy area where we can extend some grace.
Yep.
Instead of, if you see somebody post something you disagree with, instead of flaming them and embarrassing them, even if you think that what they said was wrong. I don't, an older lady that I know that shared a post on Facebook earlier today about George Floyd that I felt was, I just felt was wrong. And a lot of the stuff on the picture and the graphic was completely made up by some asshole that made the thing. It was completely wrong. And it was all about trying to blame him for his situation and trying to script. I mean, he was a felon, but trying to make some huge, long, very egregious criminal history as if that somehow he made it okay. Well, instead of just flaming this lady on Facebook, I sent her a private message. She messaged me back, says, "Oh my gosh, thank you so much. I took it down. I'm horrified." Maybe try to do something like that. Maybe if someone's attacking you, don't attack back. Turn the other cheek. Be like, I don't understand. It's like one of the things I remember somebody telling me is hurt people hurt people.
Mm-hmm.
And so recognize that if someone's trying to lash at you, they're doing so from a place of hurt. That's a primary emotion they're feeling. And so maybe don't try to fight back. It doesn't mean you're owning something that you're not responsible for, but maybe just turn the other cheek.
Mm-hmm.
The story I'll end with, in the movie, he goes to visit. Bryan goes to visit the jail, and the guy basically makes him strip search as a clear means of humiliating him. In the book, that's exactly what happens. He literally shows up at the jail. There's just this truck with a gun rack and all this horrific, really racist slogans and stuff and bumper stickers on this truck. He goes inside, and that's the guy. He makes sure that Bryan knows that that's his truck, and then makes strip searches and stuff. And that guy ends up being the officer that takes one of the other guys that Bryan represents, who is a mentally deficient gentleman.
Mm-hmm.
He ends up being the guy that takes him to the courthouse where this guy's hearings are, leading up to him eventually, I believe, if I remember correctly, being exonerated. And through hearing the injustices, that like being in the courtroom with this defendant, this gentleman that had forced him to strip, he hears these stories and he's appalled. And just one of the most beautiful stories in the book, this guy, the defendant, every time that Bryan would go visit him, he would ask him for I think it was a chocolate ice cream cone. And this poor guy who had been, wrongly imprisoned, he's trying to get Bryan to get him an ice cream. And he's like, I can't, I'm going to try again next time. This guy who had strip searched and demeaned and humiliated Bryan, he's coming, he sees Bryan coming, and the guy, Bryan's ready for this guy to give him the third degree. Mm-hmm. And he walks up, and the guy says, he says, "Yes, sir. I've got you checked in. You're good to go." And Bryan was shocked. And he says, "Well, okay." He's like, "Sir, I wanted you to know something." It's like, I wasn't supposed to do this, but I want you to know that on the way back from that hearing, I took this guy and I got him an ice cream cone. Mm. And it changes the guy's whole world. Mm. He sat in that courtroom and he heard what had been done to this man. And I mean, if you look at somebody talk about somebody with a hardened heart, this guy had it. Mm-hmm. And through sitting there and seeing this and spending time with this man in a jail transport, yep, his whole world was changed.
Yep.
And I wish they would have been able to show the second half of that story, because it's incredibly powerful as far as that man's quote unquote redemption, if you will, and how his world changed. But I think we need to think about that as well. And that God has the power, whether it's in our own hearts or those of others, God has the power to soften those hearts. And we never know what it may be that does it.
Mm. Yep. Raz, thanks for coming on, and thanks for talking. And
my pleasure, man.
From Shredding 15 Acres. We're going to make it through 2020 just fine. Our nation will.
Yes, sir.
And regardless of the results of the next 6 months, we're going to continue to have opportunities to speak into people's lives, to fight for justice on every single level, and to hopefully provide the world a better recipe for redemption than that of what a lot of people are prescribing. But thanks for coming on and having a conversation, Raz.
My pleasure.
Hopefully our random ramblings don't get us in too much trouble, So
I hope not.
Yeah. You're a good man, and God bless you, okay?
Same to you, brother.
Thank you so much for watching this video through in its entirety. If you're somebody who's been following on with the conversations and the commentary that we've been producing here, we're going to ask you to do a couple quick things. Go to lukemacias.com. You can give us your email and sign up. We will email you new content, commentary, conversations as we produce it. Also, you can, if you're on Facebook or YouTube, you can like our page, follow our page, or subscribe to our YouTube channel. This will just continue to ensure that when we produce content, it gets to you more easily. Thank you so much for continuing to support the conversations we're producing. God bless you. God bless Texas.